Andrea's here. You're supposed to be on vacation, Andrea.
Soon.
All right.
Okay. I'm gonna give it like one more minute.
Yeah. I mean, we had about 100. What did you say yesterday? 100
We had over 100.
signed up? Sure.
Mm-hmm. But, well, I mean, they expressed interest. How about that? So. All right, can y'all give us a thumbs up if you can hear us all right? Where we go?
Check for me too.
Great, thank you. All right, should we get started?
Yeah. The intro is a little bit of a slow roll anyway. So, turn on my camera so you guys can see me in all my glory here. Well, thanks for making the time today, folks. Welcome to the first of the Fluvial Futures webinar series. We are hoping to utilize this series to provide an opportunity for featuring, further in the conversation around the Fluvial Hazard Zone program. Pointing out, highlighting some of the positive successes we've had, as well as, hearing from the community. We kind of, at first, as we were talking about training opportunities and trying to think about ways to continue to get more folks up to speed on the program, talk about the different ways the program can be maybe utilized to work in your community, thinking about just technical, lifting or helping people get through some of the technical questions. We envisioned several different things, including in-person trainings, kind of like lunch and learn series, office hours, and this is our attempt to kind of be inclusive of all those things through what will be a monthly training program. And we definitely hope that there'll be some time for questions and discussion, and to the extent that it's allowed, we'll certainly field them and follow up with you as well as the different topics that we present here over the next month, next several months will come into play. So welcome, thanks for being here, and we're going to record this as well. It is being recorded, so we'll also post it for those that couldn't make it or need to drop off early. Okay, Katie, you're in charge right now, so we'll roll the next slide.
All right.
So just first of all, I want to acknowledge that this program, it's coming from the Water Conservation Board, which is under the Department of Natural Resources. These are our sponsors, and we're so grateful for their support over the CWCB's support over the years to help make this program happen, fund it. So under CWCB is the Watershed and Flood Protection section. And that's where today we're going to be focusing on, obviously, the Colorado Fluvial Hazard Zone program, but also we're talking about wildfire ready watersheds. And, I know most of the folks that are probably on this call have an interest in that as well, maybe working on a RAP. And so we're kind of, because that has come up and is such a focus right now, we want to try to get ahead of or catch up to some of the questions that have been coming up regarding FHZ and RAPs. So obviously the topic of today's webinar, also pointing out all the other great programs and grant funding and other interests of the watershed and flood protection section, and certainly not an exhaustive list, but and just let you know that these are both considered like programs, but also they're tools that can support bigger planning efforts that are happening in our communities across the state. So to let you know, since 2018, this is a map that you can find on the FHZ website, and it's actually it's a clickable map where you could scroll over one of these different stream segments and maybe learn more about when the project was done, who the sponsor was, if there are any additional links to maybe a story map or some other component. And so we're making progress. The program started in 2018 as a pilot program, and we've had a bunch of other communities get on board. And now since then, of course, with the wildfire ready action planning process, we've been adding more and more. And this is kind of where we're at with RAPS today. Probably adding some more watersheds over the next year. If you look at these maps and you're here on the call today and we somehow missed you, please let us know. We want to add your shapefile. We want to add your story, share it out there. And this also is just to let the consultants or anyone else that's out there that's working around the state know too, like, I'm doing work in this community, like maybe there's an FHZ that's already been done, or I can, find out more information, or maybe there's a RAP that's ongoing that can help me with my own planning efforts, especially as we move forward and into project implementation in the years ahead. So again, just to let you know, this is, part of a series. We also have a training that's scheduled for the CASFM conference in September. And that's going to be largely focused on taking FHZ and kind of trying to, okay, especially at the floodplain manager level, like you've got an FHZ that's been done for your community. Now, how do I use it? How do I apply it? How do I think about all the different ways to try to incorporate it into community planning? But anyway, we'll be sending out more emails. Please stay tuned. Hopefully, some folks will attend all of these. You get a gold star. But you get a gold star for coming today, so thanks. So I'm Michael, the voice inside your ears right now. My better colleagues, Joel Schultes and Katie Yacht. Joel couldn't be here today, sends his regards. So you're stuck with Katie and I. These are both brilliant engineers and fluvial geomorphologists, and somehow we all partnered together to help create the program for CWCB, and also sit on the technical advisory team to technical assistance team to help folks like you that are interested in FHZ mapping. So feel free to reach out to any and all of us as time goes on. Okay, so what we're covering today is, and we're rolling through here pretty quick, but there will be time for discussion and questions, just FYI. So what we're talking about today, we're going to talk about just hazards in stream corridors, conceptualizing what's going on post-fire, how to think about the post-fire response, and then what it means from an FHZ standpoint and a RAP standpoint as we're looking at susceptibility and susceptibility planning. Thinking about maybe, if you've got a RAP and you've got a large watershed, where to think about mapping your FHZ within that watershed. Thinking about applying the protocol and how much of it or to what extent to a RAP process. What do you do after you've done the FHZ mapping, and thinking about how to, again, incorporate it into the goals of the RAP, and of course questions and discussion. The end goal being here to let Smokey the Bear get some rest, because we are wildfire ready in our watersheds. So let's give him a break. So yeah, are you capturing the appropriate stream corridor hazards? Yeah, that was a question. Are you? Hopefully you are. Just to remind folks that we see FHZ as sitting in as a part of a complete hazard mapping, assessment, where traditionally we've been focused on hydrologic, understanding the hydrology of our systems and understanding through hydraulic modeling, inundation velocity areas, and that's been our traditional tool. Adding into the FHZ and looking at erosion and deposition across the fluvial corridor, looking at how the riverine environment that those fluvial processes might interact with marginal, whether terraces or fan faces or hill slopes, and what kind of potential erosion we might be getting from those. And we like to think that look at riverine hazards in a stream corridor, that the totality of both of these starts to become the comprehensive. It's not one or the other. but combining them both can really start to help us think more clearly about what the hazards that exist in our stream corridors. And then, of course, also the other things that are happening adjacent to the debris flow, debris fans, and hill slope erosion, and everything else that we're looking at, especially in a RAP process. So the FHZ is defined as the area a stream is occupied in recent history, may occupy or may physically influence as it stores and transports water, sediment, and debris. Importantly, you know, we developed the program to really try to look after and characterize these hazards with the goal of reducing risk to life and property by increasing awareness, avoidance, and mitigation. And so I think most of the folks on this call are probably familiar with this, but yeah, you can go to the next slide, Katie. I just want to kind of touch on this really quickly. The two core components of the FHZ, for those that aren't super familiar with it, the active stream corridor. This is really kind of, you know, sort of the geomorphic floodplain, that area of landscape that's been created by fluvial processes under the recent, you know, contemporary flow and sediment regime. It's the area where the channel's been wandering maybe back and forth and shaping that landscape really directly. And those dominant processes of incision, widening, avulsion, lateral, you know, movement, aggradation, braiding have all happened at least at some point in, you know, post-glaciation, post-glacier retreat, and kind of in our modern climate. We add on to the active stream corridor a fluvial hazard buffer, which tries to account for that erodible margin where lateral migration might, you know, affect a hill slope or something and pull material down into the stream corridor. A very important process for streams overall. You know, I'm a big fan of, like, erosion's not the end all be all. It's not the end of the world. It's part of what's, you know, happening in the longevity of a stream. But we want to define those hazards that exist there to help communities understand maybe where landscapes are at risk from your everyday and your episodic flood events. Once we've identified the core components of our FHZ, we might also consider adding on, we should consider adding on additional components. And so we developed, as we were developing the program, we were like, oh, we're not getting everything. What about those avulsion hazard zones where the river can wholesale move across a valley into an area that, you know, maybe it occupied pre-glaciation or something? What about fan faces? These are really important, and this is worthy of another webinar in and of itself. And but, you know, it's an oft missed, one of the highest hazard areas in our state. These debris and alluvial fans that come down out of steep mountain slopes. Geotechnical flags. These are important to capture still. You know, these are areas where the undercutting that might happen in a fluvial hazard buffer, the hill slope above it is still so much greater and higher that there's potential for large landscape, you know, landslide type events. And so trying to flag those for communities and for planners. Also disconnected active stream corridors. These are areas that had historically been an active stream corridor, but because of modern development, whether roadways or levee or something like that, have cut off those areas. And we like to acknowledge them both for, like, the risk that might be inherent there, but also the maybe long-term goal of reconnecting those someday if we are talking about true, like, stream restoration. So for those that you know, want more than what I just spit out, please do go to our website. On the Learn tab, we've got some great little videos that show and talk about these and provide a lot more examples, and hopefully can bring you all up to speed so that when the jargon starts flying, you can you know, hope to stay with it.
Great.
Okay, now Katie's gonna take over.
Yeah, hey everybody. I'm gonna take over for the next few slides, but you know, as Michael said, FHZs are a core component of the wildfire ready RAP development process. And we really wanted to spend some time clarifying today why that is the case. You know, obviously developing maps is important, and it's an end goal and a deliverable of the RAP process. But it's also beyond that, it's really important to kind of use the fluvial hazard zone mapping process as a means to conceptualize and communicate what the post-fire response is likely to be in our stream corridors. And while the maps kind of show the area that may be susceptible to that response, the narrative and the communication of that narrative to stakeholders and communities is just as important. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. We're not going to do any sort of, mapping exercises, but we do really want to hit on this idea of we need to be able to conceptualize and communicate the post-fire response in the stream corridors that we're working in. And this is all in the FHZ protocol. It's sections 2 and 3. It's critical to developing FHZ maps, but again, we just want to reiterate that being able to communicate this is very important. So you guys should all know this. You probably all know this, but floods after fires are very, very common due to the changes in the landscape, the changes in the runoff and infiltration characteristics of the watershed and the vegetation, a lot more debris, whether that be sediment or trees or pieces of houses, tend to transport or tend to move after or in floods after fires. Yes, let's see. And the way that the FHC program has always talked about wildfire before we even hit the 2020 fire season, which is when kind of all of these ideas came together and of using FHGs for wildfire response efforts, is we've always talked about wildfire as a watershed stressor. So there can be many other stressors in a watershed, whether that be, development, roadways, changes in land use to grazing or logging, etc. Right? But wildfire is one of those stressors that can change. It changes the response of the watershed to kind of the driving agents in terms of precipitation, and then how that drives water and sediment through the watershed. So within our FHZ framework, we've always talked about understanding reach, context, and setting, and then secondarily moving into stressors and how stressors change the reach characteristics and processes that you're expecting in a stream corridor during a energetic event, whether that be a lot of rain fall over many days or a small flash flood that's related to a fire in the watershed. So this is kind of our hierarchy and where we're trying to go and communicating what our post-fire response is going to be in our watersheds. We have a great table, 3.1 in our protocol. I want to point you guys there. Certainly not going to read this, but I do want to remind you that it's there. And we have these kind of major context characteristics: physiographic region, geologic, hydrologic, ecoregion, and geomorphic characteristics. And when we're doing our FHZ mapping and we're trying to think about communicating what our post-fire response in our watershed is going to be, these kind of lay the groundwork. And so depending on where you fall within the stable, unstable, erodible, variable, intense portions of the spectrum for your specific watershed or your specific project reach, your stream is going to have different response characteristics. Not every reach, obviously, is going to erode. Not every reach is going to experience massive deposition. But hopefully, the understanding of these characteristics is going to help us, one, figure out what those responses are going to be, and two, help us communicate with our project sponsors and stakeholders what to possibly expect, and therefore what to plan for in terms of mitigation. Kind of the two biggest things that I think about when I'm doing this is my conceptual understanding of sediment in a watershed. So where my source reaches are, and that can be sources on hill slopes, but it can also be sources in stream corridors through the processes of bank and bed erosion, and then floodplain change. I want to think about transport, what reaches of my streams are transporting that sediment, or if you have a transport reach that doesn't have a source, is that okay? Is that a problem? Or is it fine? Does that mean that we actually don't have an issue to work with? And then importantly, which is something we oftentimes have tended to miss historically is where are depositional areas. Depositional areas tend to have kind of very, very intense responses, corridor wide responses, and that's something that we really want to get a handle on, where that is existing in our watershed. But then again, kind of as a reminder, we can't have sediment deposition if we don't have a sediment source directly linked to transport processes. And so another big lens, the second big lens that I look at when I'm trying to form my understanding of what a stream reach is going to do in a big flow event, whether that be post-fire or just a flood, is I need to spend a lot of time thinking about connectivity. And typically we think about connectivity in kind of our realm in Colorado of working in streams as floodplain channel connectivity. So is the channel connected to the floodplain? Does water have the ability to move out of its banks, dissipate energy, spread out on the floodplain like you would see in the lower photo on this slide? But equally important is the idea of hill slope channel connectivity when we're thinking about stream responses. And it's critically important to understand if our sediment sources are coming from hill slopes, whether that be hill slope erosion, rilling and gulling, or debris flows. Specifically after a fire, those are the things that really kind of ramp up in intensity. If that sediment has the ability to move into transport, and if we do not have good hill slope channel connectivity, the linkages of those processes are broken. And so if we were to have, in the upper photo, so this is a Cameron Peak fire, the upper photo, we can see that we have really good hill slope channel connectivity. The hill slopes dump right into the channel. There's almost no floodplain, which means that sediment is moving hill slope to transport. It's moving. This is something that we're going to want to deal with. However, if we're looking at the lower photo and we were to have a fire on those hill slopes, there's very little, if any, connectivity between sediment generating hill slopes and the channel itself. And so our sediment would probably, in this case, move directly into storage at the toe of the hill slopes. And you can kind of see some fans on the edges there where that's the case. But this understanding between hill slope and channel is kind of critically important as we're starting to think about what the response of our reaches is going to be after a fire. So as one example, again, kind of that upper photo, this is from the High Park fire. High hill slope connectivity into transport. We're getting major changes in our stream corridor. And it's impacting, here it's impacting infrastructure. In the lower photo, you can actually see some stream work on the hill slope. So some FHB action there happening in addition to the active stream corridor action. And just as a reminder, these responses, we also kind of view as a combination of those characteristics. So understanding the hydraulic, biotic, geologic, and then kind of geomorphic characteristics is what leads us to be able to understand what type of responses we're expecting here. Conversely, here's some photos from East Troublesome fire, where we're in some major big valleys like we saw in the lower photo on that previous slide. And we're seeing a bit of sediment kind of accumulating and maybe moving through the channel. But generally, a lot of the sediment that's coming off these hill slopes is being detained at the hill slope toes and not moving into transport and causing a big active stream corridor wide response throughout the floodplain. And so just kind of wrapping this up, like this type of kind of stepping through characteristics and processing and synthesis is really where we're trying to go with fluvial hazard zone mapping. So I want to be stepping through this whole process before I even get to the point where I'm drawing lines on a map to delineate an active stream corridor. And For me, this is just an example of what I have done in the past to kind of try to communicate this. It's a really basic table that goes through the kind of the major components. But the thing that I want to point out as being important is that there is a row in here that is the anticipated post-fire response of the reach. For this study, it was a whole stream, so I kind of broke out the narrative separately for each reach, but it is important to have that in there. And again, kind of focus on that communication of what are these responses going to be. And then once you've understood that, the actual mapping of the active stream corridor comes very, very easily. So moving on from that, we also wanted to talk a bit about how the fluvial hazard zone interacts with susceptibility planning within the RAP process. And, susceptibility planning is probably the most creative portion of the RAP process at the moment. And it can take so many forms, and there's not a specific way that's being prescribed by CWCB to do susceptibility. Susceptibility is going to be unique for each RAP area, but we want to just give a little bit of, some pointers and some things to consider as you're kind of working through the susceptibility process, using the information you've gleaned from the FHZ analysis and mapping. So high level, susceptibility is the idea that hazard intersects with assets, and that's what actually gives you your exposure or your susceptibility. So we need to understand where our values are in the landscape, and what those values at risk are, and then where hazards intersect them. And we're going to go through the process specifically for FHZ and how the FHZ intersects with specific values at risk that you may see in your RAP process. So we have this drawing, or we have this image on our website. Nothing in this image is accidental. And so if you kind of maybe, I don't know, want to do an exercise in both mapping and susceptibility that's not tied to a specific landscape, you can pull this drawing down, or pull this figure down and do a map of an FHZ on it. There should be enough information on there where you could actually do it. And then within that kind of, sketch up, we can talk about how these specific assets or asset categories interplay with the fluvial hazard zone as it's mapped in our landscape. So going through this, we'll start with dams and reservoirs first. So there's a big difference between online and offline reservoirs. And so I think, right now from a higher level in susceptibility, I'm talking about doing direct intersects of values at risk and assets. So basically in GIS, taking our fluvial hazard zone delineations, adding or overlaying that on all of our values at risk, and seeing kind of what pops up, or what should pop up, and then potentially from there understanding how we're going to get to some management recommendations to reduce our full risk. Kind of the interesting one to start with is dams and reservoirs. So we have online and we have offline, and most of our data sets don't differentiate between the two of these. But the FHZ interacts with these differently. So if you have an online reservoir, kind of whether it be big or small, in order to be online, that dam needs to cross pretty much the entirety of the active stream corridor in order to adequately impound water. And as a result, and especially because of the reservoir or the water behind it, there's not an explicit risk to online dams from fluvial processes. There's a risk due to a lot of other kind of pieces of a post-fire response in a watershed, but in terms of thinking about, channel movement or bed incision or bank incision, those don't really apply to an online dam. I'm sure there is an exception somewhere in the state, and when you find it, please tell me. But as a high level, in a general sense, if there's a dam and it's got water in it, that's typically not going to be subject to those rivering processes. Please, when you find the exception, let me know, because I want to know, and I know it's out there. However, if you have an offline reservoir or a dam, there is a good chance that it is susceptible to fluvial processes. We saw this extensively during the 2013 flood. Offline reservoirs were just exquisitely good at capturing channels and funneling flow towards them and then filling up the storage with sediment. And so every kind of situation is going to be a little different as you're looking at these, and your dams and your watershed best, and your water storage and your watershed best. But definitely keep an eye out for the idea that there are offline facilities that will be subject to fluvial hazard zone or fluvial hazard zone susceptibility analysis and fluvial processes. It's more important actually that you understand the latter, that they are subject to fluvial processes and have the potential to cause and be a part of significant channel change in the watershed. Water infrastructure is fairly straightforward. So when we're thinking about doing kind of direct intersections in GIS with fluvial hazard zones and water infrastructure, diversions and intakes are almost always, if not always, needing to be in the active stream corridor, so you don't even have to look at them. In all reality, they are subject to fluvial processes. They tend to be stressors that amplify whatever those processes are going to be. So almost you don't even need to look at them. They're at risk. Pipes, canals, and ditches are going to be partially at risk. Some of them are going to be active stream corridor. Some of them are going to be partially in and partially out. And then generally speaking, every water treatment facility needs to be looked at separately. Some of them are in or adjacent to streams. Others are high on the side of mountains. It really just is going to depend on what your specific situation is. The FHZ and other water assets. FHZ does not have any real interaction with source water protection areas in the way that we're looking at them in RAPS. So that's something that we don't necessarily need to analyze or spend time analyzing. Wells, springs, industrial, may have an impact, may not, or may be susceptible to processes, they may not, just depends. Hydropower is an interesting thing to think about. So again, you're going to know your watershed best. You're going to have to think about that one specifically. And then stormwater also can get a little tricky. And it's just, I wish I had straight answers for some of this stuff, but unfortunately, a lot of this is just, you're going to have to use your brains to try to figure it out. I think the biggest thing with stormwater is the possibility of capturing detention ponds and retention facilities as well. I got a question about flanking of diversion dams. 100% Blair. If we have those kind of smaller diversion dams versus water storage dams, they tend to flank at a very, very high rate, especially if and when they're trapping debris. So yeah, I think I would consider those more as kind of the water infrastructure versus the large dams, but flanking of dams, and then additionally the capture of the river in ditches that go away from those dams is always a possibility and always kind of a risk. Transportation infrastructure, again, culverts and bridges almost are always in the FHZ, or else they wouldn't exist, right? The purpose of those is to typically go over rivers. So those, again, you probably don't even really need to spend a lot of time analyzing. And then all of the linear features, roads, rails, trails, and airports, well, airports are not linear. Those are just, they're going to be a specific, linear footage of those that are within the fluvial hazard zone are subject to those processes, and others that are not. And I think from my perspective, one of the values of the fluvial hazard zone is actually understanding the specific portions roadways that are susceptible to fluvial processes, and communicating that, because I do think that that's something that oftentimes is missed kind of in traditional hazard analyses, is the idea, like we saw in the Big Thompson Canyon during 2013, that despite being high, the road was almost completely destroyed in a lot of locations because of the idea, because of these fluvial processes that eroded hill slope toes and pulled the highway down from there. And then, of course, life and property and utilities. These are all direct intersects. It's really easy to understand these within kind of your GIS susceptibility mapping exercise. Something I've actually been spending a lot of time on this past month is contaminated sites, and how those, those are susceptible to just any post-wildfire hazard, but specifically FHZ. And these are specifically a little bit more difficult because these are often going to be in reaches you're not going to map FHZs for, because they're going to be in headwaters. And Michael will talk a little bit about that, but it is, I think, imperative to understand in these historical mining districts what mines and tailing piles and contamination sources can be susceptible to fluvial processes, and how that contaminated sediment is going to move down into kind of the bigger streams, kind of in the lower valleys, and then where that contaminated sediment might end up if it's not cleaned up in the near future. And kind of our last piece that we've been looking at is the natural and community resources. A lot of the natural resources are just 100% obviously in the fluvial hazard zone and subject to fluvial processes. Sometimes those are good renewal processes, and sometimes they're damaging to critical habitat. And again, that's just going to be kind of a case-by-case basis. But I think it is important to understand that if you've got areas of natural resources that are functioning as green infrastructure, that are actively and currently having processes that are protecting a downstream community, if those become damaged, then that community may no longer be protected. So we need to be thinking of some of these areas, wetland and riparian areas specifically, as infrastructure that needs protecting, beaver meadows, etc. Because if they're not protected in the long term, or they're not protected after a fire, then their mitigation is no longer going to be sufficient to protect the community, and then the community will be left very exposed, possibly worse off than we are currently. I wanted to stop here and ask if there are any questions before we flip things over to have Michael kind of wrap it up. And if you have questions, just throw them in the chat box, and we'll get things moved over to Michael.
Thanks, Katie. That was great. That was a lot of good information. I was thinking to myself, we could probably have 3 webinars out of just what you covered right there. And thanks for the question, Blair. Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. Just those kind of lower, small dams that will quickly fill up with sediment. Obviously, like the structure itself can pretty quickly be at risk. I think the one example that comes to mind for me with what Katie was talking about is Button Rock Reservoir, for the folks that are familiar with the 2013 flood, and that idea of like all the material came down from the watershed above Button Rock, but then kind of stopped at the reservoir. Button Rock itself, the dam had damage to it, but largely it was caused by the excess water flowing out the overflow, and not as a result of like erosion or sedimentation. Okay, well, we'll go on. You guys can keep thinking. Don't be shy. We'll write it in the chat if you have a question come up, and we'll have another opportunity before we close it out here. So, okay. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to go over, we've got about 20 minutes left. This will be fairly rapid, but trying to help those of you that are working on RAPs answer that question about where to map in your RAP for FHZ. I think these 2 bullet points say the same thing, but primarily it's all of what Katie just said. It's the idea that doing that background thinking analysis, like really trying to understand and think about the processes that are happening, where we expect to see response, where we have susceptibility, maybe some early, mapping of your VARs, early trying to understand, especially if you team up with your folks, and hopefully there's obviously dialogue happening with the team that's working on hill slope erosion and debris flows, and maybe working on the hydrology and hydraulics. Where are they expecting to see greater response? Where is your wildfire risk, the most acute? And then, and where do we expect to see all that, high amounts of water sediment delivery, and therefore these fluvial processes magnified? That's primarily what we're trying to get after, and like those are probably the areas that we're going to want to be mapping, as opposed to those other areas where we're not, we don't have as much at risk, we don't have as much susceptibility in the corridor, we don't have the fluvial processes aren't, there might be other hazards, but the fluvial hazards aren't the ones that are necessarily key, and sometimes the other hazard mapping can be the surrogate and provide the information that the RAP team needs to develop a good project and help the community, protect that resource without having to take our, I'm like thinking about all of us here in this community at this webinar, our resources to do that mapping. So yeah, it's really, that team effort. We always joke that we can't delegate critical thinking, and we're just asking everyone to critically think about these processes. Put your fluvial geomorphologist hat on and look at your watershed. Here's some general guidance I tried to come up with about, like, okay, if we've got limited budgets, we've got a huge watershed to map, what's our team been thinking about of like, where do we, put this effort and put those dollars towards providing the best benefit for our community, and hopefully the best information that's going to support the RAP. In general, we've kind of been saying, private lands over public, a lot of land that's up in Forest Service that doesn't have development happening. Maybe it's because they're, again, it's all subjective. It really depends on what the value is that we're trying to protect, and different communities are going to have different answers for that. There's an example. This is the down in like Huerfano County, Spring Creek fire, but a lot of fluvial process happening in the photograph on the right here, but a fairly wild watershed without specific assets at risk at this point. So doing a fluvial hazard map in this corridor could be helpful for just information gathering, but if I had to choose one or the other, I might choose to map downstream, think about where all this sediment that just got mobilized in this photograph is going to end up, and mapping down in that area where we have more values at risk that are more important to the public, to the community. Let's see. So also along those lines, that like, yeah, what is the value at risk and how critical is it? Fire stations, police stations, hospital, schools, reservoir drinking water versus individual homeowners. I'm sorry, but maybe not as critical to the community. And this is all up for debate and conversation. So this is not what I'm giving you is kind of like our high level thinking. In general, maybe higher density over lower density, mapping in those areas in our stream corridors. Is it something that's actionable? We've been in discussion with some groups that they're in there's very high burn susceptibility in maybe a wilderness area. Yeah, we might expect a lot of fluvial response in that area, but we're probably not going to be able to get the projects that might come up there. We might not be able to do much about them because we might not be able to go up there with equipment. We might not be able to do some of the restoration work or hazard mitigation work that we might pretend to do. So to some degree, if you can think ahead, if we map in this area and we identify these hazards, will like projects potentially come out of it? Are there actionable mitigation efforts? And then preferably we'd love to see like continuous corridors, you know, linking an upstream to a downstream rather than piecemeal. I'm going to do a mile in this stream and then a mile over here and 3 miles over there. So, you know, trying to, again, like provide, it's because we're also doing this not only for the wrap effort, but we're also hoping to leave a good you know, map for the community as a tool and a resource for them to refer to in the future. So, and it's also helpful just because we don't, our thinking is systemic, our thinking is process based from top to bottom. And so, you know, jumping around and just pulling out little snippets is also kind of breaking our thinking too. So continuous is nice. Again, another different effort to think about relative priority if you are constrained and need to prioritize. On the left side of the screen, upper left, that kind of like those really headwater streams that are steep and maybe there's not much development. Often in Colorado, they're on public lands, might not be as important. Bedrock controlled gorges where we're not going to, you know, have lots of fluvial change, flood or not. You know, those reaches that are maybe in wilderness where, you know, and there's very little happening there. Could be a large fire, certainly, but in terms of fluvial response and or not response, but fluvial, yeah, that the susceptibility is just not great in those areas. Down to the bottom left, and then conversely, as we move further out, like out onto the plains, getting into larger river systems, there might be a large fire and there might be a large response, but because of the buffering effect, as we go down valley in the system, the response, you know, there might be siltation and water quality issues, and there might be, you know, certainly maybe more preponderance of localized flooding, but maybe we're not getting the significant amount of deposition and sediment transport. And then again, those areas that are just, they're maybe way more rural, and they might matter to a certain landowner, you know, and it's up to the community to kind of, your team to think about the relative importance. Moving to the right, looking at, you know, obviously more developed areas, steeper areas, lots of energy, you know, directly downstream of areas that we do expect to have high intensity burning, as opposed to like those lower sage chaparral where, you know, even if it burns, it might not, the change in hydrology and the change in sediment loading might not shift too much from what it is existing. And then, yeah, reaches where we have lots of response, areas where we can look at and expect to see these fluvial processes happening. So a couple examples just of different projects we've seen around the state. This is down the Mancos watershed, a simple exercise to look at our different, at least at like from statewide layers, really high level preliminary, as we're thinking about scoping the project and where to allocate resources and budget, thinking about where do most of our VARs exist, and, you know, how might those tease out where we end up doing, you know, prioritizing fluvial hazard zone mapping. Also recognizing that that's not the end all be all. This is up in the Dolores watershed to the north. The red watersheds here in this image indicate higher levels of values at risk. But some of these are maybe more critical to the community than others. And so on the left-hand side, that upper, I don't know if you can see my mouse, this watershed up here it's draining into, it's forested, high, you know, potential for fire, but it's draining into the canyon on the Dolores River, and so the upper canyon there. And so it's fairly, you know, it's a wilderness study area. The canyon itself is geologically fairly set. You know, it might impact recreation, sure, it might, you know, but it's the asset that it's at risk. Like mapping in that corridor is not going to give us a whole lot of new information. Whereas mapping in these other areas down through Rico, down through the community of Dolores, there's a lot of private land in these corridors. And so providing that kind of information. And then I just want to point out on the lower bottom here in the green, the lowest southerly sub-watershed there, it didn't light up with tons of VARs, but there's a big corridor of private land there. And as the community of Dolores grows, you know, there's potential for a lot of development in that area. So I added that in because I want to capture that and give that to the community as a future resource. And sure, it might not be the most wildfire process prone, but you know, and I'm already sitting here, I'm thinking about this watershed, I'm thinking about processes, and I want to give this community, you know, a really good map to leave with. Moving on, Middle Colorado, just letting you know, like the detail, we do dive into the detail here, and I had to switch up protocols a bunch here. As this is Elk Creek going through Newcastle, I had to go into an urban mapping protocol for the downtown area. Same over in Rifle. There's changes in fluvial hazard buffer widths. And then over on Battlement Mesa, this is the left side of the screen, these red lines, those we decided to do with just the headwaters protocol. So adding a buffer off of a stream center line. So just different geographies, different assets, different process expectations, you know, required me to flip around for that wrap a lot. This is the Boulder watershed, or St. Vrain, Katie.
Hey, yeah, sorry, I was in the chat talking about mines.
Cool.
Yeah, so this is our example for the Boulder and St. Vrain watersheds. All of the highlighted streams there have active stream corridor mapping. However, not all of them are going to do full FHZ mapping. But the reason we chose that specific subset, you can see they're all the kind of mid-elevation streams that are typically within the canyon areas. And generally speaking, probably the most likely to have a burn in the coming years. But the other main reason that I wanted to kind of look at those is that we know as geomorphologists that these reaches are the ones that are most likely to interact with their hill slopes and have kind of big fluvial hazard buffer interactions. And I also happen to know that a lot of homes sit within those fluvial hazard buffers in those reaches. And so understanding that these geographically within the watershed are the areas where the hydraulic modeling is most likely to be insufficient for capturing the hazards, I wanted to grab these to make sure that we could have a good understanding of the actual risks that were posed to a lot of these homes and roadways within these areas. And again, being able to use that to communicate both with the stakeholders and floodplain managers and owners in these areas to, again, talk adequately trying to talk about the specific risks that they are exposed to.
Oh, that's great. Really great point about catching that gap between the hydraulic modeling and what we're expecting for processes. Thanks, Katie. Okay, so yeah, what level of detail? This is a question we get often. And effort, you know, is really appropriate for FHZ mapping for a wrap. A little bit more than the photo on the right, the image. And you're not going to like this answer, but it's the same, really. I will say there's a few caveats that, you know, we're not expecting third-party review. It's definitely not mandatory. You know, like we might ask for in a regular fluvial hazard zone, you know, grant project that might happen in, you know, on its own separate. We probably are not going to, you know, because of budget limitations, going to be able to get out in the field as much as we'd like to. You know, we still think you should go out into the field and calibrate your mind and you know, and look, maybe take a closer look at some of those challenging areas to map and make your decision based on what you see and everything else that you know. You know, make sure your delineations are making sense, scaled appropriately and all of that. You know, but perhaps there's a little bit less scrutiny overall. You're not trying to, you know, get to every, you're not, maybe not worried about like, is it like 5 feet to the right or 10 feet to the left? You know, I mean, that stuff starts to consume time and resources and you know, we want a good map. We want a map that's useful. We want maps that can move forward and be used by the community. But we realize there might be a little less scrutiny happening at the wrap level. Perhaps your fluvial hazard buffer doesn't have as much critical information in it. You know, I shared the example of me changing like fluvial hazard buffer widths as I'm working through the Middle Colorado wrap. You know, I'm also more skilled at it, but it's time consuming. So, you know, perhaps, you know, but we do want a fluvial hazard buffer on your maps because that's, as Katie was just saying, is such a critical area that can be missed. please don't look past those other hazards that we have in our communities. You folks are doing the important work to put your mind towards these geomorphic processes, and we want you to be thinking about and marking fans. And if there's a big avulsion zone, we had one that pop up in one of our communities, that it's an ideal opportunity to identify it. Let people know, just like long range planning, that this could become activated if we do have a wildfire situation. Especially, it's a great opportunity to activate avulsion zones because of all the excess sediment and water. Geotechnical flags, yeah, might be a good opportunity. And then please, or perhaps you're skimping on the report, but not the documentation, and the documentation, but not on the delineation. I'd rather have really good map products that are more accurate than a large report full of fluff and background information. I still think like the example that Katie shared was really great about, give me a table that like shows me that you've been thinking about the geologies, the background, the hydrology, the changes, the processes, the trajectory that you're expecting to occur in this watershed, because then that just, it supports your map, and it also supports someone coming in down the road behind you and saying, okay, this is like the thinking and the thought process that went behind it, and this is why the lines look the same. So great, you've done all that. Congratulations. You are now in an amazing place to help your RAP team identify actions and become in a really good part of the hazard mitigation planning process, because your mind's been in this world of thinking about how are these stream corridors going to change in a post-wildfire world. And so this is pulled directly from a fact sheet we have on the Wildfire Ready Watersheds website. I'll point you all to that for further diving in, but basically trying to then think about a lot of what Katie was talking about. Are we directly impacting our values at risk in the fluvial hazard zone, or are the impacts more indirect, helping your team think through those based on your FHZ work? And then looking at, okay, now what do we do about it? Do we take operational actions to mitigate? The fluvial hazard zone can inform these, and it's more like community education and awareness campaigns, looking at redundancy, emergency preparedness planning. This FHZ is really great for that. Thinking about early warning systems, zoning, easements, that kind of like, community level policies planning. And also you'll be thinking about physical actions and opportunities to lessen the severity or degree of the hazard, thinking about how you might be able to protect an asset by, shifting its configuration or location, thinking about opportunities to buffer these processes, maybe upstream of assets that are immobile, by things like stream corridor restoration, floodplain reconnection to attenuate sediments and water and debris that you're expecting to come down through the corridors. So yeah, I think that kind of brings us, obviously pointing you back to the websites for more information, pointing you towards more of these. Our next session is going to be in July, and we're going to be joined by the folks that are working on the Bear River wildfire RAP, and they'll be kind of presenting like how they went through this process. It'll be great to hear from someone other than us, I'm sure. We'll be there to support questions and talk it through with you all. And yeah, I think that's it. I'd love to open it up for 1 minute of questions. Hopefully, maybe you got some in the chat. And please follow up with us as well.
Yeah, thanks everyone. There's been some good discussion in the chat about a couple things. So if there's any more questions, I think you guys can turn on your microphones and ask us via your voice too, if you have them. There's a good question about mines from Carolyn in Crested Butte. And the question was, is there ever a time when you're not concerned about mines? And yeah, my response was that typically, I would be concerned about all mines, but not all mines are subject to fluvial processes. We had a good discussion there. You can read it. But I would then also maybe add that one of the other things to consider is that if you do have a large slug of mine waste that gets mobilized into your stream corridor, you can kind of go through and think through the consequences of that in your location specific has has the potential to dramatically change your fluvial response in your lower stream corridor, somewhat like a debris flow would. So if you get that big slug of mine waste and you end up with building this big kind of debris fan out in your lower valley, that does, you know, if your valley is wide, it has the potential to kind of move the channel over, you know, plug the channel, move it over in the floodplain, causing an avulsion, and then potentially backing flows up. If your channel is small, it could potentially dam the whole of the canyon or the whole of that channel. And then again, back flows up, and then you may see some sort of debris dam release, which could amplify your fluvial, you know, your fluvial hazards downstream of there as well. So every situation is going to be different. And unfortunately, doing this work, Michael and I have become, you know, adept at looking at worst case scenarios, but still trying to have an optimistic view of the world. But unfortunately, like, that's kind of the process that we need to go through with some of these on an individual basis. If there's something that we're specifically very worried about, you know, you kind of have to step through that. I also have seen, you know, I also know of some Superfund sites that sit in the fluvial hazard zone. And that's another specific situation that, you know, we want to think through. I mean, they're capped tailings piles, but I also can imagine that there's going to be processes that are expressed in the river corridor in the vicinity of those that have the potential to erode into them, or, you know, and increase some channel incision perhaps, and then start letting the caps and the sides of those slough into the transport of the channel. So, you know, it's not always fun thinking about that stuff, but it is interesting, and it's always better to kind of know. So again, that just goes to the conceptual kind of thinking through the characteristics of your reach response, is almost more important than the mapping, but we really do want the mapping too. Anybody else? Thanks, Mason.
Yeah, thanks, Mason. We're realizing the guidance is maybe a little bit, the wraps are out ahead of us, but we hope this was really useful, and potentially we'll start to form this into some further product. But the first step was getting it out there to you today. So thanks for everyone for attending. Yeah, I really appreciate it. Thanks for making the time, and have a good rest of your day.
Yeah.
Thanks, Carolyn. Thanks, Natalie.